Hello and welcome to the Womxn Show. I'm Lanina Rasool, and today we are going to be speaking about women and women's stories and women's literature, and we're going to be unpacking the inclusion of gender-based violence within literature. After the break, we're going to be speaking to Professor Barbara Boswell, who is a writer of 3 books and the Associate Professor of English at UCT. We are going to be unpacking some of Professor Boswell's books, and we're going to be looking at the inclusion of gender-based violence. But before that, we're going to have a look at a short video where people speak about the role of writing in their lives. Let's have a look.
The Life Writing Collective, I think, has a powerful role to play in our healing as a nation, because we don't just get to tell our own stories. We get to hear each other's stories from a very raw place of personal truth. And when that happens, there's this amazing moment of identifying with someone that on the surface you thought was very, very different to you, you know. And that's what I think needs to happen a lot more in our country.
My name is Dawn Garish, and I am a co-founder of the Life Writing Collective, which is a non-profit organization. And out of my own practice, I discovered how helpful writing is to help one reflect and communicate better, manage your anxiety. And I've taken that practice and am teaching it to other people.
Attending the workshop, the writing, it was for me a healing process and also a sharing time.
There were queer women there from the Fees Must Fall movement, radical, outspoken. There were other people of color, and mixed up with sort of older people that could afford to self-finance themselves coming to the course, and this made for an incredible dynamic. The diversity there ignited everybody to not be contrived, to not fall into stereotypical feedback and questions of one another.
Especially if you've lived kind of a life that has been curtailed by institutionalized violence, really. You know, apartheid, racism, sexism, ageism, all these isms that divide us are there also to keep the lid on what is possible in terms of community and personal growth. So we're lifting the lid off with this approach.
We need to know each other's stories. I think that it's vital that we know each other's stories so that we can get a better understanding of the human condition.
Yes, I'm hoping that the courses and the book that's in its second print now will attract people from on that level too. People who want to lead, young people who want to lead in change in the country, and that understand that writing and creativity and memoir writing and storytelling is a way to lead within their communities.
The LRC is a group of people who have experienced what writing can do, like the transformation it can have in their own lives. And they are now working really hard, most of the time volunteering their time to give these tools and give this platform and this art of writing, of life writing, to people who cannot afford.
The Life Writing Collective isn't a course. It's not a short-term program. It's a community of people who hold a safe space for others to share the journey of their life in their own voice. And I think that's a very powerful thing. And as I said, as somebody who works to create inclusion in a country that's as diverse and often divided as ours is, I think that's a critical missing in our society.
In African continent, a child is not raised only by the family but the community. So that we need this community to grow and to work hand by hand, like together. togetherness and keep it alive, because it's a noble project that will touch many lives. Is a baby that needs to grow, and when it is a baby, the baby needs support, and that is a financial way so that this baby can grow.
Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and today we are speaking about writing, we are speaking about domestic violence, we are speaking about the history of women's rights, Black women's writing, and Black women's activism. And to help us put all of this together, I am in studio with Barbara Boswell, who is a writer and an Associate Professor of English at UCT, and we've got some of her books here on the table. Barbara, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Lenina, for inviting me. I'm so honored to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you. I'm so excited to be in conversation with you. So the audience doesn't know, like, I've been trying to get Barbara on for a while. But Barbara, we are here to discuss some of the books that you have written and some of the issues that are brought up in the book. But before that, I wanted you to tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got to writing.
Okay, thank you. I am a writer, and I started writing. I grew up in Belhar and in Elsies River in the Cape. And, you know, I loved writing and I loved stories, and my parents told me lots of stories, and my granny told me lots of stories. So I was always fascinated with that. And then I remember the year that I learned to read. It was just phenomenal. I loved, then I could read stories on my own. I didn't need someone to tell me. And so from that point on, I think I was 6 years old when I thought to myself, I want to be a writer. I want to tell stories and write stories. And from there, I just, you know, I became a journalist like you.
Yeah.
And I worked as a journalist for probably most of my 30s. And then I only published my first novel, Grace, when I was 43. So, yes, 45 actually. So, you know, if you're a late bloomer, it's possible. But that was always my passion. And I was writing a lot academically, because then I became an academic when I was in my 30s. But I was longing always to write fiction. I was part of a writing group called Women's Expression and Artistic Voice, Weave. And this was a group of Black women poets and fiction writers who were meeting I think they started in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And I joined them as an administrator. And then I did my master's thesis on Weave at UWC. And I was just so inspired. But I still, even though I was every day almost around poets and storytellers, I was still too scared to actually dip my toe in and actually start writing. But eventually I did, and only very late. I was already in my 30s when I started seriously writing Grace, a novel, which is my first work of fiction.
Thank you. That is inspiring, you know, especially for me. I'm
Yes.
40, so I'm like, it's not too late.
It's never too late.
So, speaking about Grace, which is the book closest to you, and I think that was 2017.
Yes.
Yes. So you got there, and you know, you write an introduction in the book. So that book is really, let me read it here. So you describe Grace as a fictional account of a family on the Cape Flats living with the open secret of domestic violence. Then you also write, my writing on the topic started while I was completing a doctoral degree in gender studies, an academic discipline that gave me the language to describe and make sense of the violence I had endured as a child. And just like for context, I think that you write also in that introduction that there was domestic violence within your home, that you and your mother and yourself and your sister eventually were able to leave that situation. But I wanted to ask, what do you mean when you say it gave you a language?
Because I think when you're a child, especially, and you're in a situation of abuse and you're being continuously abused, it becomes part of your world. And it becomes, you internalize it. This is the danger with being in abusive situations, that you internalize it and you normalize it. You think it is my fault for being abused, and you think I deserve this, and it's because I'm a bad child that I'm being abused, or my mother's a bad woman, that is why she's being abused. But when you are able to, the thing that studying allowed me is to see gender as a system and gender-based violence as systematic. When you're being abused, you feel like you're the only one. You are ashamed and you're alone. And when you realize that this is a systematic problem, that is when you start to realize that this is a structure. We call it a structural problem. Women abuse is a structural problem in South Africa. So a lot of us who are abuse victims or abuse survivors, we are maybe sitting alone in our homes thinking, I'm the only one. I'm bad. I'm full of shame. I deserve this. This is always going to be my life. But when you are able to see the broader picture of gender and gender-based violence as a structure, that's when you can realize it is not me. This is a system that started maybe 100 or hundreds of years ago in the Cape with slavery, where people were bodily disciplined in very harsh ways to control them. And that continues.
That makes violence normal.
That normalizes violence. And that is when the first thing you need to realize when you're being abused, it is not me. It is not my fault. And that is the impetus that can shift you in order to move out of that abuse. I do think you need to have that realization that this is wrong and this should not be happening to me. But when you are alone and isolated, as abusers do, they isolate you in order to be able to continue abusing you. That's when you are immobilized. And so when I say that I started learning the language of liberation, that was part of my liberation. Because while I was no longer, as an adult, being abused in my childhood home, the trauma of having lived through that and having to deal with that constantly still as an adult, the trauma, if you don't process it, it doesn't leave you. It inhabits your body and it inhabits your mind. And so until you can realize, I actually didn't deserve that, it wasn't my fault, and what happened to me was wrong, and it's happening on a massive scale to many other women. But once you have a language to analyze the system that produces that, then you can also strategize as to how do I leave this abuse? How do I manage this abuse? How do I get out alive? Because many people don't get out alive, and we almost did not get out alive.
Thank you. I have a lot of places I want to go with what you just said, but I want to come, since you brought up it's a systemic problem, it's a structural problem, and then you used in that introduction this open secret thing. And I just want to so in my early years, just before my mom and my dad divorced, so my memories are like running to the neighbors, for instance, to go use the phone, And I remember there was this pivotal moment, even so young, where I realized, wow, this is not the way normal life was.
Yeah.
It was so normal. But it was also normal because that violence was contained as an open secret in our street.
Yes.
So everybody knew.
Right.
And so I just wanted to ask you about, I think, the silence or the inaction of bystanders and everybody around you. Does that sort of, to you and your thought process that it's just me, it almost feels like, yes, it is my fault because nobody is doing anything about this wrong thing.
Right. I mean, as a child, I didn't experience it in that way. I think we had a lot of family members, not our neighbors. Our neighbors knew because they could see it and they could hear it. But they didn't want to get involved because it's a family dispute, right? It's not, we don't get involved in personal problems. We don't get involved. We help you when you need help, when you need some other form of help. Or you need a lift, or you need a cup of sugar, or you need an onion. They help. They're very helpful people. Everyone's helpful like that. But not that. But we did have adults in our lives that were talking against it all the time, but it was always whispered. It was shameful. It was the shame of it was the most immobilizing thing. And then there was the church, and we grew up Catholic, and you can't divorce in the Catholic Church. It's not allowed. So there was that whole thing. So the church was also often involved. Like I remember nuns and priests coming to our home and talking about it, but they weren't saying, "Get out and save your life" to my mother. They were saying to my father, "Stop hitting your wife." It's funny because I have also memories of my father he did really try to beat this addiction. We went to AA, and then we went to Al-Anon, right? So there were attempts, and then there was moments of like sobriety and long
we also,
periods, but then it never quite could last, and then the violence just got progressively worse over the years. Like every episode was more violent than the next one. And that's the pattern with gender-based violence and intimate partner violence. Eventually, you are very highly at high risk as a partner of being killed, because over the years the violence just got worse. It got increasingly bad, and then it started with children. So initially, my father never hit us as children. We were two girls, so that's really taboo. But I don't know, in his imagination, if you could hit your wife, probably then you could hit your daughter. But he never initially would hit us. But then, it came to a point where we started being beaten also. And that is, there was just a lot of, it intensified a lot towards the end and of the relationship. And so there was just a time, I think, in my early teenage where and everyone around us were like convinced we were going to die. But somehow there was still not a movement to
leave.
To leave, yeah, because
To help you to leave or to tell you to leave, yeah.
I mean, people were telling us to leave, or not us, but my mother. But this, she wasn't ready, and so you also have to be ready. But I certainly felt, probably by the age of 12 or 13, I really felt like I don't really know women live much longer, which is a terrible way to live. Yeah.
But, I mean, you say one other thing also, I just want to read this. You say living with abuse, apart from being life-threatening and soul-destroying, also increases the chances of abuse continuing into the next generation of a family. These are all issues I sought to highlight in the form of fiction, which gave me the space to imagine how this fictional character would rationalize and cope with abuse on an emotional level. And so when I read that alongside the one where you found the language for this, I thought that's really interesting, because many people from under-resourced communities are not going to go and become an academic and study the system of gender-based violence. We're sort of still stuck, right, with the old narrative of normalized violence. And so I just wanted to ask about the power of fiction. Whether that played a role in your deciding to write fiction. And let me see if I can share this language with fiction, because we know in academic language it's very dense and it's not going to reach like my mother or and even if it didn't play a role, though, the power of storytelling and fiction to be able to help us to see things like it being a systemic problem.
Yeah. So I want to just say I speak openly about this because it is partly to stop the taboo about talking about it. And I feel like it's necessary to talk about this. This is why I talk about my experience of that violence, this extreme violence. And so this is part of still working with my own shame around it, because it still is there sometimes, somehow. But to answer the question about fiction, is that, yes, I wanted to work with this and I wanted to tell a story about it. And so I started out with, I was writing some of the scenes of my childhood, and then I started fictionalizing it. And I wanted to show then this child that grows up, who is Grace, in this house, and the kind of violence that happens there. What are her choices in her life as an adult? Because Grace is a protagonist who doesn't, her trauma doesn't get dealt with. She doesn't tell anyone. She, in fact, not to give away the plot, but she makes up a story in her adult life about where she comes from and what happened to her parents and what happened to her. And that is the story that she gives the world, and that means suppressing the truth of what actually happened. And I think when I wrote this, I wanted to explore through fiction what is the journey of this character and what happens to her, what happens to us when we suppress those things and we lie about it, not only to the world but to ourselves. We say, I didn't have a bad childhood. Like, yeah, okay, stuff happened, but it wasn't so bad. I'm okay now, but you're actually not okay. A lot of us are not okay, and we don't want to admit it.
Sorry,
And-
Barbara.
Yes.
We have to take a quick break,
Okay.
but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we are speaking about women stories. We are speaking about gender-based violence, and we are still here in studio with Barbara Boswell, who is a writer and an associate professor of English at UCT. And Barbara, before the break, we were speaking about the use of fiction to sort of share information. I just want to, if I can recap, I can say I read 2 parts of your introduction, which was one, when you started studying gender studies, you received sort of a language to explain some of the violence that you had experienced as a child, framing domestic violence as gender as a system and domestic violence as a systemic problem and a structural problem. And then later, I brought up that these are all issues I sought to highlight in the form of fiction. And you were just explaining how you wanted to show this journey of Grace, who had experienced a lot of violence as a child, but then created a different persona when she grew up. She didn't deal with it, she didn't process it. She just wanted to move forward with her life, so she buried it. And I think we stopped when you were going to say, it doesn't go away.
No, unless we work with it. If you've been traumatized, and especially if you've been a victim of violence, and sustained violence, it does something to your personhood. It does something to your body, it does something to your mind, it does something to how you relate to other people in the world. And so, we need to deal with those kinds of traumas if we want to be healthy psychologically and physically. But to the question around fiction, I felt just compelled to write this story, and I wanted to explore this in fiction. Fiction is perhaps not the best way to reach people anymore, because I think maybe I should go make TikTok videos if I want to reach people. But, this is the form that I love and that I also wanted to master the form of writing fiction. And so I used the seeds of my story to create a fictional world with fictional characters and explore what happens to them in the aftermath of this very traumatic domestic violence as a childhood experience.
I also loved a lot of what you were saying in terms of using fiction to explore different options, right? And so often, not just with gender-based violence, but with anything, I think, we're going to speak about Black women, we're going to speak about your story and looking at the history of Black women writers, but I think especially as women of color, and definitely with writers I've spoken with before, we have because of the way we grew up and how under-resourced it was and the little exposure we had, we have a very limited narrative of the choices that we have and the types of people that we can become. And it's also informed by, for a lot of us, this violence and shame and, so I loved that you're speaking about the use of fiction to explore different options. One of my favorite quotes is, "You can't be what you can't see," and so people. I would imagine people reading Grace could see, "Oh, this is what it looks like for this way. This is what it looks like to create a different persona. This is what it, just exploring, and then what could happen." Your latest book is The Comrade's Wife. And I gave Barbara, and I give the audience a disclaimer, I haven't read it yet, but I have read sort of the sample that was released by Jacana, and also it's also about the relationship.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe you will start, just tell us basically what The Comrade's book is about.
So The Comrade's Wife is again about an older woman who gets married, a second marriage later in life. And her husband is a politician, and they're very wealthy, and they live in opulence. And we just watch this relationship unfold and also unravel. So, and then we see how I wanted to explore power and how power relations I'm very much obsessed with South Africa as a country. And Grace is a novel of transition for me, because we see Grace growing up and then becoming a free citizen in the democratic South Africa. And The Comrade's Wife, so some people have said they see a lot of similarities in, there are threads that carry through both novels. And I think The Comrade's Wife is a post-democratic South African novel, because I set it in 2016, and I wanted to highlight from the perspective of a spouse, a wife specifically, what this politician is doing as a politician, and someone who's very powerful and has a lot of influence and power to change things. And the things that he's doing, how he maneuvers, what he's doing in the country at this moment, and how that translates into the intimate space. Because I wanted to explore really powerful people and how they, when someone's powerful and they're a public persona and they're out in the world and we see them on platforms, there's also a kind of persona that is crafted for that. And the ethics of that, and how they bring those ethics into personal space. So the micro space of a man and a woman who are in a house together, in a bed together, and then there's a larger stage of the nation, and how they operate on both platforms.
And how that filters in, especially the ethics and the morals and what you get away with in the macro world, and how that filters. So I only did a small piece, but I also saw the threads of gender sort of coming through. So I remember the one that struck me was how, even though they, it was both their second marriage, and they had all these discussions about how they were going to prioritize each other, and they didn't want to get divorced again, but because his job was, I don't want to say it, it comes across his job as more demanding, more important, etc. And there's this space of tension just in this where she is sort of taking on the care work role. So even though they're going to go, they prioritize each other by having dinner one night a week at least, having dinner together. But because he's so busy, not that she's not busy,
he's just busier.
He's just busier. She's like, and so it's interesting to see this bubble up of resentment. That space was interesting for me. She doesn't agree with it, but okay, I'm gonna do it anyway because he's just too busy. And I think a greater prioritization of him. And so even as in a post-democratic society, South Africa, even with resources, even with a good job, even with all of that, she gets into this relationship and she sort of falls into this role. Was that also something? And I don't know if there's gender-based violence in The Comrade's Wife, but also, part of the thing that I thought about was if there is, this is a different take on why doesn't she leave? like, because she's got resources, she's got, but we know that these gendered issues, it doesn't necessarily need to be violence. It could be manipulation, it could be cheating, it could be emotional abuse or verbal abuse. In Grace, with Grace's mother, she almost couldn't leave. There were resource constraints to her leaving. Here we're looking at a different take where there are no resource constraints.
Yeah, right. So what I wanted to look at also is the class position and so both of these characters, they come from very impoverished backgrounds, and then they become, the man becomes wealthy and the woman becomes not as wealthy as him through her own work, but she becomes a middle class person who owns her own house and she has everything together, and he has everything together also. So I suppose in this setting, there's a lot of, in Grace, there's a lot of the houses degraded and ugly and broken windows and broken stuff like that. It's not cared for. But here there's opulence and luxury and wealth. And still to look at how does this system of gender function even in that setting? When you think of, when you've grown up maybe impoverished and you have money and you become wealthy perhaps, you might think all your problems will go away, right? But the system of gender and gender relations and our gender roles are so ingrained in us that those things are very hard to change. And even in a post-apartheid society, in a democratic society, in our constitution where we have equality, we can change laws, but it's often so hard. It's much, much harder to change the culture than it is to change the law. We have a process. You put in you make a process through Parliament and then an act come out, and then a bill, and then it's debated and voted, and then a bill is passed. There's a pathway to how do we change the law? How do we make it illegal to assault your wife? How do you make it illegal to rape someone? How do we change definitions of rape? There are clear ways in which that is attainable under legal structures. But when we look at culture, how do you change deeply held beliefs that because of my gender, I deserve to be served? I'm entitled to the labor of a woman as part of who I am as a man. How do you change that?
Or you're allowed to be disciplined if you've done something wrong. And I'm just thinking about like all of the, many survivors come on the show and say they go to the police station and they're just like, go home and fix your marriage.
Right.
What did you do
to deserve this?
To deserve this, yeah. And so, and discipline, I think, just coming back to normalized violence, discipline is a legitimate way of responding to something a wife did wrong. I'm just going to say, that's what that brings forth. Barbara, we don't have a lot of time left, so I really want to get to my story anyway. So you did also a work of nonfiction. I'm one of those people who have to go, nonfiction is real. Fiction is not real in my head before I say it. So, and I use this book as a textbook, guys. Like, I have learned so much in the past year. So Barbara knows, I send a fangirl, messages and all this stuff, when I've read something new. Tell us about And Wrote My Story Anyway.
So this, And Wrote My Story Anyway, is a history of Black women's writing of fiction in English. I have to say all of those things because Black South African women have been oral storytellers for decades, for centuries. And they've also written in other languages. But I wanted to really do a history of what Black women wrote in terms of storytelling, in terms of fiction, in the beginning, in the 20th century, and somewhat into the 21st century also. So what I've done, part of what this book does, it creates a history of Black women's writing. It documents this is how Black women started writing, and this is what they have produced. There's one chapter, chapter 2 is like the mega chapter where all the history is. And then the rest of the work is, there are 10 chapters, I don't remember. But I analyzed 10 books that I think are important foundational works of fiction by Black women who published in English, and what they tell us about ourselves as women and what they tell us about the nation, and how they also work as feminist theory. Because I believe, because Black women generally haven't been given the same opportunities to go to universities and produce knowledge in the same way as other people, other populations. So I think our main way of theorizing the world and creating theories of gender and gender justice is through storytelling and telling fiction. And this is what I do in Grace, this is what I do in the Comrades Wife. And then now I was analyzing, how do other women writers do this? What are they writing about? They're writing all about power. They're writing about race. They're writing about sexuality. They're writing about homosexuality and what is a taboo. They're writing about rape. And I wanted to look at collectively what is the work that they have done so far, because this is such an ignored tradition in our country and in literary studies. So this is my academic work, this is my academic project. Because we get told as Black women, oh, you are not theorists, you're not intellectual workers. I saw the other day a comment about, we always thought to be writing about our lives when we write. And we are creative workers, we are intellectual workers, we are imaginative workers, we are creating stories for a purpose. And I wanted to look at that in more detail and analyze it and say, look, here are Black women who were theorizing, and they were making feminism, they were making feminist theory through their art. And we need to look at that. So this is what And Wrote My Story Anyway is about.
I want to ask you, I mean, I love that. And I actually think that we need another episode to actually dig deeper into that, right? And then I've sent you fangle messages about Black women's writing and legitimacy and the stuff that I'm learning. The biggest aha moment for me when I was reading this book was there's so much in it that I don't know. And I really loved your personal story that intros this, where you were a young journalist and you were told to, I think, review a book by
Bessie Head.
By Bessie Head, who's...
I don't really deal with Bessie Head in this book, because I do analyze her work a little bit, but there's a lot written about Bessie Head already. She's one of our best known South African Black women writers, but who was in exile in Botswana and died there, so she never came home.
Your aha moment was, oh my goodness, Black women writers. I didn't know. You didn't know, right? And so it's that you can't be what you can't see kind of thing. It's like, oh, Black women can be writers, even as a journalist. And so for me, it was also that thing, it's just like, and I remember always wanting to be a writer, but then I studied journalism, and journalists are not supposed to write about certain things, right? And so my dreams of writing a Mills and Boon sort of went out the window, because I was convinced that was my pathway. And now I can't write Mills and Boon because I'm a journalist. So what can I write? Stick to facts, etc. But my aha moment was like, oh my God, look at this! Look at all of this history of Black women, Black and brown women, people who like me who wrote books. So I want to ask about the importance of us knowing our history, like how it has impacted you. This book exists, that history exists, but like you said, it's been invisibilized. It hasn't been shared mainstream. What is the importance of us going as women, as Black women, going into this theory, understanding that there is a history?
Yeah, I think it's so important for us to understand, because when I think about feminism, I think about liberation, and liberation for us as women and men, and people who don't identify as women or men, gender non-conforming or non-binary people. It's the whole project, I think, of intersectional feminism is freedom from oppression at a very basic level. And for us to imagine our freedom, we need to actually know other people have imagined freedoms for us also. And especially Black women, who were the most oppressed under apartheid, have been very creative in imagining freedoms for us and for themselves. And I think when we go to them and we look at their imaginations and we look at what did they see freedom as and how did they conceive of freedom, and we can learn from that because we are not free yet. We are partially free. We came out of apartheid, but the other apartheids, there's economic apartheid, there's violence against women and children. And we need to be able to really, in order to complete the project of freeing ourselves collectively and individually, we need to be able to envision what does freedom look like. And these women help us through our history, through, I deal in this book with the pass law protests, the March on the Union buildings, the 1913 protests against pass laws by women. All of those things feed into our literature. They write about this stuff, not only in academic terms or in reportage, but in fictional terms. When we look at Cross of Gold by Loretta Ngobo, she shows the pass law protests in Soweto. She shows how the passes operate. And we need to know our history to know where we need to go. Because also, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. Like sometimes you see an idea crop up and it's a good idea and it's a brilliant idea, but like women were writing about that 50 years ago, actually. You didn't invent that. And maybe you don't know about that, but it's worth to go and revisit. Like people always say, that there's this idea that progress happens through time, that as we move through time into the future, progress is happening. But there was a lot of progressive stuff happening in the previous century, in the 1920s, people were always resisting and always plotting and planning their freedom.
I know, I have to tell you, we have to go to a break, but one of the things for me, which was a journey through time, is to read about Audre Lorde writing about apartheid South Africa. And it could totally be written right now, exactly as it was right now about Palestine and women there. But Barbara, we're going to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we are speaking about women and women's writing, and we've spoken about domestic violence and the history of Black female writers is what we ended off in the last segment. And we are still here in studio with Barbara Boswell, who is a writer of these wonderful books that you are seeing on the table, Grace, a novel, The Comrade's Wife, and Wrote My Story Anyway. And Barbara is a writer and Associate Professor of English at UCT. And Barbara, before we went to break, you were speaking about the power of fiction and the importance of knowing sort of the history of, I don't want to say just Black female authors or writers, but also of Black women, Shanaz Matthews, who was on last week, she said this really important thing. She said, a lot of the young activists today we are protesting, and we are doing the work with activism, but we are unaware about the history of activism and some of the stuff that have been done before. And I have been percolating on this quote by Adrienne Ditch, who said in the 70s already, she said, every generation feels like they are the first one to experience this oppression. But it's not true. And as she says, we are I'm paraphrasing, but we are divorced from the history of oppression that those who came before us have done. And so, we're always starting again instead of like learning. And that really came back to me when you were speaking about it's important to know what's been done before so that we don't reinvent the wheel. But because we only have 5 minutes now, and you were saying such beautiful things about imagining our liberation, and you were saying things about using fiction as a tool to imagine what our lives can be like, imagine the different choices. I want to ask you, how can we start now? I mean, if the easiest thing we can do to start imagining a different life for ourselves is to pick up a piece of pen and paper and spark our imagination. What does that process look like?
That's a fabulous question. And there's an essay that was written in the 80s where Mariam Tladi says black women don't have time to dream. And that's why black women aren't writing in the 80s. But we are in a different moment, we're in a different political space. And we, in fact, do have time to dream. And not only with pen and paper, it starts, you must be able to imagine something different for yourself or ways of liberating yourself. And I think even though we have more freedoms now, there are also these things that ideology curtails our freedoms. Because where apartheid was an ideology of white supremacy that said black women aren't thinkers, they are beasts of burden that need to labor and clean houses and look after babies, and that's the only thing for them. It's in the nature of oppression to invisibilize itself and obscure itself, because that is how it continues itself. Because when you can't identify it and name it as this is oppression, then you can't do anything about it. When you can't see it clearly as oppression, you can't fight it. So that's the first thing, to see. And what we have today in this moment, we're post-apartheid, but there are other forms of oppression. There's gender oppression, there's homophobia, there's transphobia, there's xenophobia. There are these things that are conspire. There's capitalism and patriarchal capitalism and racialized capitalism, and they co-conspire to form this matrix of domination, which Patricia Hill Collins calls it. And that's where intersectionality is important. But to imagine, to spark your creativity, look at systems like the media and how they are contributing to us being, our senses being dulled and our intellects being dulled. What are we being fed on social media, on Twitter, on Instagram? We are being fed ideologies of how to be human. And that is and on TV. I don't know if people watch TV so much anymore. Netflix, those are realms of where ideology is produced. And ideologies generally function either to keep us in our place or to free us. And so if you can create a space away from these things that are creating messages all the time about consumption, you need to buy this thing, you need this product in order to be happy.
Oh my goodness, face care for 10-year-olds, which is...
Yeah, and it's beautiful and lovely to look after yourself and care for yourself. And you do actually need face cream at some point. I'm not against face cream, but what is being sold to us?
Yeah.
And create a space, create a clearing. There's a poem that I love that says, create a clearing. Before you can save the world, you need to create a clearing for yourself where you can think and see clearly. And to create that for ourselves, because we're being kept busy by demands, by work, by caring for others, by children raising, by caring for our spouses, our families, our friends. And that is good and noble work. But we also need to create those clearings for ourselves where we can actually dream. What do you dream about? What is your greatest dream? What is the best thing that you could dream for yourself in this moment? And write it down, and write your dreams down. Have a journal about your life. What do I want for my life? This is one of the ways of charting what does freedom look like. Most of us don't even know what does freedom look like for me. If someone said to you, you can be free now, we would say, oh, I want money. But economic freedom is one mode of freedom. There are other ways of being free that we need to imagine for ourselves individually and collectively. And so I think writing is a very powerful tool for that, to chart what do we want, what do we need, what can we imagine, and what is constraining our imaginations. There are a lot of things constraining our imaginations, and to identify that and try to work through that.
I absolutely love that. I'm also thinking, If you can sit down and write down what freedom looks like, it might even expose the ways that you are oppressed that you can't see. But we are out of time. Oh, and I just want to say, if you're like me and you struggle to understand what you don't know what you want, go and read, because I think what the books give us a lot is also permission to create that space when you see other women have done it. It legitimizes. Barbara, thank you so very much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you. And I had a good time.
Oh, I'm so glad. And thank you very much for joining us. And that brings us to the end of the show. I'm Lenina Rasool, and this is Barbara Boswell. Goodbye.